3 Disturbing True Trucker Horror Stories, Volume 7. Number 1. As a trucker for most of my adult life, I've seen the country and driven out in the middle of nowhere. The work can be lonely, but that is part of the appeal. However, there was one time in the early 2000s when I almost quit being a trucker. It was early spring, and I was driving through part of the Midwest, which had been particularly dry that winter. When we have dry winters, the first rains of the spring can be particularly dangerous, as well as the dried oil and grime on the road starts to seep upwards toward the surface. This causes major slick spots, almost like black ice. It had rained that morning before I got on the road, so I knew that I needed to be extra cautious when driving on parts of the highway that only have 2 lanes. I was driving at a good pace when I saw a vehicle in my side view with a driver that looked agitated. I saw him only for a moment when I glanced at the mirror, noted the look on his face, and braced myself for the potential of him doing something stupid. You can tell a lot by the look someone has on their face, and this includes whether or not they're going to be aggressive on the road. My first instinct was to let him pass me, so I slowed down to let him have enough room to get ahead. I looked over at him as he drove by me, and much to my surprise, this guy was flipping me off and screaming something that I obviously couldn't hear. I shook my head and leaned forward, thinking it's best to just ignore him and move on. I watched him get slightly ahead of me, but still at a point where the rear end of his van is adjacent to my truck. I thought he was going to pass way too close, but lo and behold, he tried to swerve over into me, as in he tried to hit me with the back end of his vehicle. I pulled slightly onto the shoulder, thinking, my God, what is this guy's problem? At this point, on this stretch of the road, there really aren't any other vehicles around. It's just me and this guy, so I pulled to the right, slowed down a bit to let him get ahead of me a few feet, and then pulled back onto the road within a few seconds. At this point, he's ahead of me by a couple of car lengths, so I assume he's going to move on and just be an idiot elsewhere. Unfortunately, that was not what he did. Instead, he started hitting his brakes and slowing down. I started doing the same, and there was a bit of back and forth between him and me, speeding up and slowing down to the point where I was actually getting annoyed. Then that annoyance turned into immediate panic and terror because instead of just slightly slowing his car down to annoy me, he actually slammed on the brakes of his car. At this point, I was already back up to a decent speed because I didn't think much was going to happen beyond his little slow down and speed up. I slammed my brakes as best I could and attempted to roll to the right to minimize this collision because that's what was going to happen. It was going to be a collision no matter what I did. As I mentioned earlier, the road was somewhat slick, and slamming my brakes, shifting to the side, I ended up clipping his van at an angle that caused it to flip and drag in front of me. I did everything I could to try to control the situation and tried to cause minimal damage. The unfortunate truth was there was no way for me to minimize the damage with how we had connected with the road conditions, and with the fact that I later learned he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. I had to pull over to the side of the road and assess the damage. My heart was racing and I was shaking with adrenaline. I knew that this was going to be a serious incident and that there was going to be a lot of paperwork and consequences to deal with. I called my dispatch and reported the accident, and they told me to wait for the police and emergency services to arrive. I also tried to check on the other driver, but it was clear that he was seriously injured. I felt a deep sense of guilt and responsibility for what had happened, even though I knew that it wasn't entirely my fault. When the police arrived, they took statements from me and the other driver. They also did a breathalyzer test on me, which I passed without any issues. I was relieved that I hadn't done anything wrong, but I still felt terrible about what had happened. The other driver was taken to the hospital with serious injuries, and I later found out that he had suffered several broken bones and internal injuries. It was a sobering reminder of just how dangerous driving can be, especially when people are reckless and aggressive on the road. In the weeks and months that followed, I had to deal with the aftermath of the accident. I had to fill out countless forms and reports, and I also had to attend several meetings with my company and with the insurance companies involved. It was a stressful and time-consuming process, but I knew that it was necessary in order to resolve the situation. Despite everything that happened, I never seriously considered quitting my job as a trucker. Yes, the accident had been traumatic and had caused a lot of damage and pain, but it was also a reminder of why I love being a trucker in the first place. I love the independence and freedom of the open road, and I know that I'm good at what I do. Number 2. I used to work as a truck driver for a company that transported shipments between states, and sometimes across the southern border. I'd been in this profession for a long time and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened to me. However, everything changed when I experienced something strange on one evening in early July. As the sun was setting, I was driving down a road listening to the FM radio, and Carry On, Wayward Son was playing. Right around the chorus, the radio signal started getting iffy, and the music would fade into static for a few seconds before coming back. I thought it was a range issue and started messing with the radio dial. However, when it landed on 88.9, There was no music, just static. Annoyed, I cranked the dial all the way to the right and noticed that the static had disappeared. Strangely, there was no music either. Suddenly, a sound sputtered out of my radio without warning, which lasted for a second. A single long tone. I was unnerved as the gaps between the sounds lessened. It was getting to the point where they were playing one after the other consecutively. Thinking some station was doing tests, I decided to switch the receiver to a different frequency. I scrolled through the bar and landed somewhere in the mid-90 range. Interestingly, the new station was playing the exact same noise. I kept scrolling and eventually I got down to the 80s, and all the stations were playing the same robotic tones. In the middle of the desert, I didn't know what was going on. I decided to switch off the radio, but then the tones cut out entirely. Suddenly, something else came on the radio. A song. After a while, I recognized the lyrics. Scarborough Fair. It was an old-fashioned English song that my parents used to dance to when I was a kid. The audio had a certain whine to it, like the song was being played off of a record. I scrolled my radio again and I went all the way up and down the range. Sure enough, the same girl was singing on every single station. It was around this time that I realized I hadn't seen any other vehicles. It was late, but this was a massive highway, not some back road in the desert. I expected to see another driver, but there was nothing. I was unnerved, but I kept my eyes on the road and let the song finish. Suddenly, I noticed something out of the driver's side window. It was a faint outline of something in the night sky, about 50 feet above the ground. It was big, about 15 feet in diameter, and black as a shadow. It stuck out like a sore thumb against the off-blue sky. As I watched it silently, it hovered above the ground, maintaining the same distance parallel to my truck as I drove down the highway. I was getting more and more freaked out and didn't know what to do until the radio kicked back in. There was a series of another few tones, and I wanted to turn it off, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt that if I turned the thing off, I'd anger it, so I continued driving and the thing kept pace with me. I was glad when I finally saw another vehicle on the road. This was the scariest experience I ever had as a truck driver. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The memory of that night still sends chills down my spine. Number 3. I'd always enjoyed driving alone at night, but one terrifying experience changed everything for me. It was late, around midnight, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The road was dark and deserted with no street lights to light the way, and all I had were my car's headlights to guide me. Lost in my thoughts and enjoying the silence, I suddenly saw someone appear in front of the car. I hit the brakes hard, and my car screeched to a halt. Getting out to investigate, I found there was no one there, and an unusual and unsettling silence filled the air. As I was about to get back in my car, I heard a faint whisper coming from somewhere behind me. Turning around and calling out, there was still no one to be seen. But as I got back into my car, I felt a strange sensation. The engine was acting abnormally, and the headlights were flickering. It was then that I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the roof of my car. Looking up, I saw a ghostly figure of a man with tattered old clothes and pale, translucent skin staring at me. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell that he was staring right at me. Frozen with fear, I couldn't understand what I was seeing, but I knew that something was wrong. The man on the roof of my car was getting closer and closer, and I knew that I had to do something. Without any second thought, I decided to abandon my car and started running in the opposite direction towards a huge tree. But the man was following me, and I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer. As I turned around, I saw the man standing behind me, floating in the air with a grotesque expression on his face. He was holding an old pocket watch, ticking wildly. It was so horrific that I lost all my strength and felt as cold as ice. I turned around and kept running, shouting for help, hoping that someone would come to my rescue. I looked around for any sign of life or any other car for help, but there was no one to be seen. It felt like something terrible was about to happen, and I could hear the man's voice whispering in my ear. Eventually, I came to a crossroads and saw light in the distance. Running towards it, I found a gas station and collapsed on the ground. I was shaking and my heart was racing, and the gas station attendant called an ambulance. The doctor said that I had a panic attack, but I knew it was more than that. That night was not normal, and no matter what anyone says, I wasn't dreaming or hallucinating. Something was there, and I had seen a ghost that had followed me and tried to take me with it to the other side. I don't know what it wanted from me, but I know that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never drive alone at night again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe for more content like this in the future.